I wanted to start by saying what a pleasure it is to be here at the Arnold Arboretum. When I spoke at the 100th anniversary, the centennial of the Arnold Arboretum in 1972, I said it's good to be at a place so venerable that our garden was only 13 years old when you started. On the other hand, when William Trelease, our second director, started a scientific journal at the Missouri Botanical Garden in 1889, Sargent wrote him and said, "Please do not proliferate the literature by starting yet another journal. If you produce anything worth publishing, send it to us, and upon consideration, we'll publish it for you." So what I want to speak with you about tonight is China, biodiversity, and the global environment, and I'll try to give you some thoughts that I have about how it all fits together and how we can think about it. China, of course, is an idealized place in all of our minds, and the Great Wall is one of the ways we think about China. It sort of symbolizes the romanticism and the interest of the country, and how fascinating it was for Europeans when stories of China began coming back there 800 or so, 800 or 900 years ago. Now, so that's the dream image of China in a way, the Great Wall. And this is more or less the way the Great Wall looks today, at times. There are an awful lot of tourists in China, and the vast majority of the tourists in China are internal tourists. It's interesting, not people from the outside. And of course, it has led China to have to take special considerations that I'll talk about later for dealing with tourists in the parks and reserves and other popular places in the country. Now, one of the things that I want to say to you that I consider very important is there's a book by Orville Schell and John Delury called Wealth and Power. If you just write down Wealth and Power, you'll remember it. You'll be able to Google it. Those are two Chinese characters, sort of the ideal that Chinese have sought after during the whole course of their history. This book begins in the time of the Opium Wars in about 1830s, when China was being forcibly opened for the British to sell opium there, and of course cause enormous widespread opium addiction, so that they in turn could get money to grow tea in India and supply the need for tea in Britain. A nice deal. But at that time, the sort of foreign concessions were started in China. The foreigners made all sorts of demands about places being open to them and reserved for them. And China began a long period of relative depression and foreign domination. And if you read the book Wealth and Power, you'll find out about the philosophers and people who spoke out about this during the 19th century. And you'll also find out how it led to the modern era and how some of the terrible things that happened in the modern times, like the Cultural Revolution, in the context actually begin to make sense if you understand the history, because China was basically ripped apart between being an ultra-traditional society and a society that, as Jonathan Spence and other people have brought out very well in their very good books on the subject, realized very strongly as the Qing dynasty, which, by the way, did you know that the Qing dynasty started the same year that Harvard did? It was pretty good, 1636. Well, the Qing dynasty was coming to an end then, but it was really in a very isolated, kind of decrepit and kind of foreign-dominated kind of situation. And Jonathan Spence, who's a historian at Yale, brought out the fact, and people do bring this out, that the Japanese boarding a Chinese ship and totally superior to it in every way in the 1890s was a big wake-up call for the people in China, in a sense, as sort of a symbol of the fact that they were so far out of the modern world. And that began a long, very complicated struggle internally, philosophically, as well as factually, between tradition, which is so important in a 4,000-year-old country, and modernism, which provides the knowledge to achieve the long-held ambition of wealth and power. And so it's a great story and a great book, and I strongly recommend it to you. China is also the home of incredible biodiversity. I'll talk about some of the details for that in the future, but of course the reason that explorers have found so much of interest in China is simply that its flora and fauna are incredibly rich by Northern Hemisphere standards and incredibly worth investigating and incredibly interesting. Now, human populations in the world began to expand at the time when domestication of crops was begun, and that was in about 12,000 years ago, probably in Turkey, probably in Anatolia, we think now. And it took about 2,000 years more before people really began to depend on cultivated crops for their livelihood. And of course, when they did, then cities could begin to grow, villages could begin to grow, towns could begin to grow, cities could begin to grow, and as they grew, having supplies of food to pass unfavorable seasons and to see them through, as they grew and as more and more people were able to live together, we got away essentially about 10,000 years ago from the hunter-gatherer style of living, which would have had groups of 30 to 60 people going around in the forest, beating small mammals over the head and gathering berries to eat and so forth, needing to accumulate as much as they could and to use it on the spot. We began to accumulate specialization of professions, of pursuits in life, and we began to see in those cities storytellers, musicians, civic leaders, religious leaders, and all other kinds of society, musicians, storekeepers, farmers, begin to specialize and begin to build up all the customs that we recognize as part of our civilization. And if you read the writing was invented about 5,000 years ago independently in Egypt and in Babylonia, Assyria, and then a little later in China, a totally different kind. But then, of course, what people had to say could be passed down literally, which it couldn't be before. So they got a more accurate idea of what was going on, and in effect, expanded their minds so that they began to think about the whole array of living things in the world instead of just those that were around them and meaningful for them. Now, at the time that 10,000 years ago, when people began to live in villages and towns and so forth, they were able to do so because of the supply of food. The total population of the world after 2.8 million years of human history on Earth was about 1 million people. About 1 million people in the world, about 100,000 people in Europe. And as you can see on this diagram, the population began to grow, our population began to grow, and of course with it our impact on the environment. At the time of Christ, there might have been 300 million people in the world. At the time that Malthus was writing, which was, let's see, I think this is this Willis Point? Yeah. Let's see. Oh yeah. At the time that Thomas Malthus, the English clergyman, was talking about food supply not being able to grow as fast as population, there were about 800 million people in the world, much smaller than the population of either India or China at the present day. And as you can see there, the population hit a billion for the first time in Napoleonic times. It took 123 years for it to hit 2 billion. It took 33 years for it to hit 3 billion, 24 years to hit 4 billion, and 13 years to hit 5 billion, 6 billion, 7 billion, and we're now at 7.3 billion. One of the things that this diagram shows very clearly is that anyone who says to you that human beings have had problems before and they've overcome them and they'll overcome these problems too is a nutcase. Because there's never been anything like this before in the history of the world. There's never been anything like this degree of dominance by one species. And of course, population is fundamental in driving the using up of the world's resources, and we often think of population first, and it is absolutely fundamental. Joel Cohen, then of Rockefeller University, wrote a very good book called How Many People Can the World Support some years ago, and of course the answer is depends on how you want to live. But it's not only that, it's that, well, let's look at the current world population. 35 years, it's projected to have grown by 2.5 billion people more. By the end of the century, 11 billion or more. This is actually wrong. There are actually 220,000 people net being added every day, which means that in an order of approximation, when the world sits down to dinner, if you want to view it that way, there are 220,000 more people looking for food than there were the day before, about 6 billion a month. And in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, there are about 850 million people now, and they're projected to be 2.2 billion people 35 years from now. So about half of this growth is occurring in sub-Saharan Africa. So when you think of sub-Saharan Africa, you have to, you know, being economic, getting on its feet economically and all, you have to kind of see that in context in order to really understand it. Now in the 7.2, it's actually 7.3 billion people as of a couple of weeks ago. In the 7.3 billion people, as I said, this is still not updated, it's about 220,000 a day, but what I want to call your attention to primarily is that about 800 million people are currently malnourished, which means they grew up without having adequate nutrition for their brains and bodies to develop properly, and that's permanent, and about 100 million people in the world are on the verge of starvation at any given time. So when people say, if we really get to a crisis, then people will begin to react to the world situation, you have to kind of begin to wonder what a crisis would actually be. And of course, again, you could say Malthus was wrong and Paul Ehrlich was wrong and so forth, but many hundreds of millions of people have starved to death along the way. So in what sense are they wrong? It's true that we didn't all disappear in a puff of smoke, but on the other hand, the situation is very dire. Now, let me make the situation more personal. This is the famous botanist Peter Raven. In about 1940, and I'm intent on feeding that squirrel, not knowing any better then. I should have been writing taxonomic papers, but no. And what was the world like in 1940? That's my lifetime, right? You saw me. 2.3 billion people were around then. Now there are 7.3 billion people. In other words, there are more than three people alive now for every one person who was alive when I was feeding that squirrel. 1940 US population, 132 million, now it's 324 million. 1940 China population, 520 million. Today it's 1.4 billion. You can see a couple of things from that. One thing you can see is that China hasn't been growing as fast as the rest of the world, as rapidly as it's been growing. The rest of the world has gone from 2.3 billion to 7.3 billion, China from 520 to 1.4. So less fast than the rest of the world. The US very rapidly, but also not as fast as the rest of the world. Now, population is not the only item that drives world problems. Population is fundamental. The number of people in the world produce a basic drain on the world that has to be contended with, however you might look at it. But affluence or consumption goes into it very strongly. How much does each person in the world consume? And the kind of technology we use goes into it very well. There are lots of ways you can illustrate, goes into it very strongly. There are lots of ways you can illustrate consumption, but I think one very graphic way is to look at the amount of food that a Western European family of 4, 2 children, would consume in a week. And there it is. And then, what do you think that picture would look like for someone in West Africa? That's the amount of food that their family of 5 consumes in a week, and that's just a sort of a vignette about consumption. And when you look at the difference between those two pictures and you realize, you start thinking about impact on the world, you can immediately realize that the impact of the one is much greater than the other one. Is that a bad thing? Well, we'll go along and we'll examine that. Now, what about consumption in China? China, as I've said, has about 1.4 billion of the world's 7.3 billion people. Its ecological footprint, the amount it consumes, has quadrupled in the past 4 decades as population has gone up, more slowly since the one-child policy, and as consumption has risen rapidly, and sort of industrial revolution level technology has spread. China's ecological footprint, and we'll talk in more detail about what that means in a minute, comprises an area about twice the size of the country. China passed the US in the production of waste and of greenhouse gases over the past few years, since 2010 or so, but of course has 1.4 billion instead of 325 million people. So the production per person is much less. As countries like China go up the food chain to eat more meat, to consume more meat, you get about 1/10 of the amount of nutrition that's in an equivalent amount of what the cattle eat, or pork in this case, eat, than you get from them. In other words, the more meat you eat, the less productivity you get from the land you have. There is a sect of Buddhists who are now becoming vegetarians precisely for this effect, to spare the earth. But it's obvious that as countries get richer and richer and they want to eat more meat, the situation gets tougher and tougher. One of the notorious problems in China is air pollution, obviously, and that's partly due to an ill-advised policy during the time of Mao Zedong to spread industry everywhere, to have every part of the country self-sufficient, partly just due to insufficient attention. But now the leaders of China are paying a whole lot of attention to it, and you probably read in the paper that a YouTube kind of short that circulated in China was hit by something like 30 million people within a very short space of time. The thing about air pollution is people who are rich can have better food, but everybody breathes the same air. So again, for Ned's benefit, I want to show a picture of what the Harvard delegation in Shanghai will be like next week. Yes, it's Beijing, but that's a very serious, but Shanghai is equally polluted. I've been on the roof of, I've been on restaurants like on the 16th story in Beijing and not been able to look out through the glass of the window. So there are many, many excess deaths due to pollution, anywhere, depending on the estimate, from 400,000 to 1.4 million per year in China. And the problem goes on. China's major cities are all polluted. Small atmospheric particles, of course, which come from unfiltered coal and so forth, are the chief cause, and come primarily from producing electricity. 400,000 premature deaths, that's a very low estimate, are caused by those particles. And of course, Beijing itself, the capital, is establishing a satellite city like 40 miles out in the country for the government to live in, and companies are hesitating to send families there and everything, or to anywhere in China, because of this runaway pollution. And it's a problem that they must solve. They're devoted to solving it, and I believe they will solve it. Now, Global Footprint Network, with the website Footprint Network, one word, is a think tank in Oakland, California. And they measure, and I urge you to Google that, Footprint Network, the website. They measure the comparison between biocapacity, the bioproductive area available per person in an individual city, country, the world, or whatever, against ecological footprint. How much bioproductive area do we demand how much do we demand to live at the standard of living at which we're living? And here are the components of the ecological footprint. And as you can see, there are all the well-known ways in which we use up or use the environment, and how much of that there is available for each person can be looked at worldwide or for individual countries or whatever. So how much of the world's sustainable productivity are we using up now? Global Footprint Network estimates that it was 70% in 1970. Now we're estimated to be using 156%. And you can look at the network and see exactly how they got to that. And that means we need 50% more sustainable productivity than exists. But the bad thing is, see, here's the current human population and the estimated growth, something like 9.6 billion by 2050. The bad thing is the 800 million people who are malnourished, or the 100 million who are on the edge of starvation, would not be helped in the slightest by having 56% more capacity. The only thing it would mean would be we weren't running down the world's sustainable capacity as we went along. Here's a way to look at that in individual nations. A Global Footprint Network in 1961, as of 1961, did this diagram where the green countries are self-sufficient. The deeper green they are, more self-sufficient. In other words, they produce more, they have more ecological capacity than the people use in achieving their standard of living. And look at China, India, North Africa, and so forth there. And then here's the same notation for 2011. Now that means that every country there that's in brown uses more than its capacity, which means either it's running down its own sustainable productivity faster, or it's importing things from elsewhere that are enabling it to live at that level. And that, of course, is 50 years, but it's a tremendous, it's 40 years, but it's a tremendous difference between the two, and it goes on growing. The brown countries have nowhere to turn, living at the level at which they're living, and I'll show you some of the relationships now. This is Great Britain, which has always been colonial, and the sustainable, it's in hectares on the left. Look at that, because that will differ in the next two slides and two images that I'm going to show you. The sustainability, the capacity is in the green line on the bottom, and the footprint is in the brown line on the top, which in the case of Britain means largely that they've already been able to import things from the colonies, as for example by forcing the Chinese to become dope addicts to get money to grow tea in India and so forth, and strategies like that. Here's the situation in the United States. As you can see, in about 1965, the lines crossed, and as the population grows, our sustainable capacity goes down, and our ecological footprint is sort of level, but at a very high level, one of the highest in the world. And we drive it down as our population grows and so forth, which means, again, we either get it somewhere else or we're using things here so hard that we can't look towards any kind of stability. And here's the situation in China. As you can see there, look back at the left-hand side there, you notice this, the sustainable capacity in the United States in 1960 was up around 7 hectares per person, and now it's all the way down to 4 hectares per person. But look here, in China, it's at 1 hectare per person. The biocapacity is staying about the same, but the ecological footprint has grown enormously, but it's still up to only 2.5 hectares per person, much less than in the United States. And then look at this. Here's how many Chinas does it take to support China, which is the line on the top. But then look down below at the other countries there. How many Denmarks does it take to support Denmark? How many Egypts does it take to support Egypt? The line of dots going out is Japan, 7. And you may have read about 3 months ago, the Japanese government very carefully made some comments about the fact that they might be beyond the economic standards of living that they could afford. And you have a really serious kind of political problem there, because no politician is going to be successful running on, I want to reduce your consumption levels, or hardly on, I want you to have fewer children. The only thing that will really support that, which is the theme I'll come back to, is people supporting it and creating an atmosphere where they insist that it be changed. Because if it's enough of a popular feeling that things are wrong, then people can change it. Look at the United Arab Emirates there at the bottom. See, the United States is 4 up, and so it goes, and look at the world on the bottom. And the kinds of pressures that this creates is just one single example. Sub-Saharan Africa has about 850 million. I may have said this before, and it'll be about 2.2 billion in 35 years from now. Nigeria is one of the fastest growing countries in Africa, and they're already having huge conflicts there, both between the Muslims in the north and the others in the south. And just a simple vignette, cattle herders, from a couple of days ago, cattle herders killed 82 people and wounded 25 in a battle over grazing rights. It's kind of just a symbol of the kind of world that we're sliding further and further into. So, there's a book that was created by a chair headed by by a committee chaired by Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was then the Prime Minister of Norway, and the report is Our Common Future, and it presents a picture of a world in which all countries will come up to the level of the United States and so forth and be able to consume as much as they want. And is that really possible? Not with available technologies, not if we take Western Europe and the United States as standard. It's patently impossible. And if it is patently impossible, then a lot of the dreams and images that may be projected by politicians are going to turn out to be just that, dreams and images. So here's Global Footprints Network diagram. Where we are is in the middle. If all the countries in the world took a very drastic course over the next 35 years, we could get back to 1 Earth on the lower bar, but if it just business as usual, be at about 2.3 by the middle of the century, 35 years from now. And you can read that website and you will find all of this well documented in it. So when you look at that, you get a very different view of the kind of life we have in the United States and the kind of life that people have in China, the kind of life that people have in countries around the world. And you realize that the situation is much tougher than we normally think about it as being. So why is there a problem? Just summarizing, it's at a record level and continues to grow by 220,000 net per day. Our individual levels of consumption in rich countries are huge and climbing rapidly, faster than population. Consumption is growing much more rapidly than population. And then technologies developed during the Industrial Revolution, when our total population was around 750 million, are just not good when they're used at this level. They're destroying us, and we have to find new technologies. And When you see attitudes about things like the president's war on coal and so forth, you realize how greedy human beings can be and how much they think whatever is going on can be extended for as long as they want it to go on, so people can go on making money, and if you can business as usual during your life. It's probably a kind of a Stone Age attitude that if you're going around bopping animals and so forth, you better bop as many as you can, better get as much as you can. Now, biodiversity, which is particularly germane for here, I'll just summarize to begin the discussion. Those organisms that live in the world make up the living fiber of the world and are essential for our lives. We will have to build global sustainability on a basis of their properties because they are the functioning Earth, and we're driving them to extinction at an unprecedented rate. Think first, before we get onto the current picture, and everybody says we're really driving things to extinction now. Now, 11% of the world is crop agriculture and 20% of the world is pasture, most of it unsustainably grazed. That all expanded to about 1/3 of the world's land surface in a matter of 10,000 years at the end of our 2.8 million year history. How many kinds of plants and animals do you think were driven to extinction while 1/3 of the world was converted? Now it's going even faster now, but we're already long since in an age of very rapid extinction. We depend on biodiversity in many ways. All of our food comes from plants, directly or indirectly. Most of our medicines come from living organisms, directly or indirectly. We have great expectations for the future in the 50 years that we've had a good run at molecular biology, and anybody who's following that will see that between gene editing and epigenetics and so forth, what we know about molecular biology is far less than we've thought we've learned. And ecosystem services, in that the collective assets of all of these organisms really drive the character of the world we live in. And then finally there's beauty and interest, which is no insignificant thing. So food. We get over 90% of our food from 103 kinds of plants, directly or indirectly, out of about 425,000 that exist. We get 60% of it directly or indirectly from 3 kinds of plants, rice, corn, and wheat. 2/3 of the people in the world use plants directly as their source of medicine, starting with China, India, Latin America, and so forth. And even for those of us who get medicine in the drugstore, about 1/4 of them came from plants or still come from plants. Ecosystem services, beauty. That's a Chinese butterfly in China sitting on a bougainvillea from the Pacific. But it's a beautiful picture, and I should say that it, as well as many others in here, were taken by my wife, Pat, who's here and who helps hugely with arranging and organizing these presentations. So how many kinds of organisms are there? Well, other than bacteria, which nobody has the foggiest idea how many there are, probably too many, but I estimate there are about 12 million species. Only about 2 million of them have been identified yet. So when we talk about extinction, most of those that haven't been are fungi or small algae or small animals and so forth. But it means that as extinction rates go up, as I'll show you in a minute, the vast majority of the species that are being lost have never been cataloged, are really unknown. There's no reliable way to estimate total numbers, and we know next to nothing about most of those, even if we've named them. Usually it just means there's a small corpse of one of them sitting in a bottom of alcohol in the Natural History Museum in London or something, which was said to be collected somewhere near Manaus in the central Amazon basin. So the fact that it's called Allenwinia smithii or something really conveys next to nothing in the way of information. So we're losing things that we know nothing about. As some people have often likened this to a destruction of a library. It's like having a library where you've only read 10% of the books and you're busily ripping out the pages of the others and pouring them into a fire. Now in China, there's I think about 1.3 million species of organisms, which is about an eighth of the total world species. About 1/10 of these, about 130,000, have been identified. The 49 volumes of our Flora of China, which was a cooperative Chinese foreign project, have about 31,500 species. Harvard was a major participant in the Flora of China with Dave Buford, who has been at the Arboretum much of the past several decades, being your leading participant in it. Somewhat surprisingly to us, when you do a modern revision of all the plants of China, about half of them are found only in China, and biodiversity in China is being destroyed at least as rapidly as biodiversity in the rest of the world. Of course, that's one of Pat's pictures. Teenage pandas. At Wolong in the panda reserve that was destroyed in the big earthquake in Sichuan, but it's been rebuilt since. Why China is so rich, very briefly, is that many more kinds of organisms survive there than elsewhere in the northern hemisphere, which was pretty uniform at one point. For example, dawn redwoods are well known as a species that survived in China. There are about 6,000 wild dawn redwoods in China, about something like the number of pandas that there are in China, but pandas don't make seeds, so you can't propagate them as easily. There are millions of, but the point I want to make is dawn redwoods were the commonest tree in the forests in western North America 40 or 45 million years ago, and of course completely gone. In China, you can migrate south and then you can come back north. So as the climate changed, not so much the ice ages actually, as the great drying out that started about 15 million years ago in the middle of the Miocene period, they could still move to suitable places, whereas in Europe they're cut off by the Mediterranean, and here they're cut off by the Gulf of Mexico and deserts and the big narrowing and so forth. The numerous mountain ranges in China afford lots of opportunities for development of distinctive species, as of Primula, Rhododendron, Pedicularis, and other groups whose main world supply is in China on those different mountain ranges. And then finally, of course, China reaches right down into the real tropics, where it shares in the diversity of Southeast Asia. About half of the species in China are found in Yunnan province, which is the southernmost one on the mainland. Now in China and worldwide, species are disappearing very rapidly through habitat destruction, through global climate change, invasive alien pests and pathogens, and the overgathering, the thing about medicine and the thing about bushmeat in Africa, of certain kinds of plants and animals, fungi and nature. So spreading development, those are all Chinese pictures, grazing and so forth. Worldwide grazing, and as I say, about 20%, about 1/5 of the Earth's land surface is grazed, and most of it is completely unsustainable. And then we have global climate change, driven, as the Swedish Nobel Prize winner Arrhenius pointed out in 1890, by humans putting gases into the atmosphere and creating a kind of a greenhouse effect in which heat was trapped under them and then continually heating the world. And the thing is, there's a lag effect in it because the interaction with the ocean is very slow to get settled. So even if no more of those gases were emitted at all from now on, the world would go on heating probably another degree or 1.5 degrees Celsius. But if we go on diddling about it and are making agreements only lately, then it's going to go on a lot worse than that. And of course, in mountainous areas, or in areas near the southern ends of continents in the southern hemisphere, the northern ends of continents in the northern hemisphere, the species that are in the higher elevations or the cooler places will simply be driven to extinction if they have nowhere to go. Sea level rise is another problem. North Carolina legislature at one point threatened to pass legislation which said that you could never refer to sea level rise in any planning document. And this is the actual record. The red line is observed by satellite, so there's a pretty good chance that it's accurate. And you know, in the United States, the federal government insures all coastal property, which means that as it floods, and all the communities near the coast push shopping centers and things down into the lowest possible levels, which means that when that all comes due in 10 or 20 years, we the taxpayers will be responsible for about $2 to $3 billion worth of insurance debt, which couldn't be budgeted. In socialist Britain, on the other hand, private insurance companies insure all coastal properties, and they're all doing very well financially. And the government's main role is to discourage people from building there. But here we have the freedom to build there. Isn't that great? Vietnam looks for a loss of 1/3 of its productive land during the course of this century, and Vietnam is one of the few rice exporters in the world. China looks for the loss of about 25 to 30% of its 3 major coastal industrial areas and is rebuilding them all inland from where they are now to try to make up for that. Invasive aliens like this South American water hyacinth shown here in Vietnam are a plague worldwide. You come to things like malaria being introduced into the New World and driving the whole layout of the place. A very good book is 1493 or 1491, a pre-Columbus view of North America, and then 1493 is an expansion at global trade spreading all over the world, and that's how you got things like this going. And then gathering plants all over the world like this ginseng for medicine. Now, specifically about China's environment, their economic growth over the last 20 years has averaged about 10% a year. The cost of the environmental damage, if built into the GDP, would be about 8 to 13%. For 1 year, the environmental ministry in China tried to put that in the major accounts, national accounts, but they were shooed off by the economic development people. And the figure will double. The percentage of the GDP that's affected by environmental loss will double over the next 15 years. So China is implementing many programs to try to solve those environmental problems because they're perfectly obvious to them. Extinction rates worldwide, you can do this by looking at fossils of appropriate groups, about 10 per million per year. Since the invention of movable type, or the importation of movable type into Western Europe, about when species were documented in writing. And all of these are extrapolations from the extinction in known groups to the whole number. About 100 per year. Now we're about 1,000 per million per year. And it could approach 100,000 per year as this century goes along and all these pressures increase, particularly if global warming continues to get so far out of hand, which means that at least half of all species would be gone in this century. And one of the awful things about that is it's not so much what money we can make from any one of them, it's how they fit together to produce a livable world. In the tropics, if you cut down tropical rainforest, about 19 out of 20 of the species that you kill off will never have been seen by a scientist. Here's a good perspective on the world situation. I don't know if you've seen this diagram, but this is the weight of land mammals worldwide. Human beings are the dark squares in the middle. The one on the left is cattle. The light squares are domesticated animals, pigs, goats, sheep, and horses, and the small green squares around the outside are all the other land mammals in the world by weight. And I think that really shows quite clearly what kind of a pressure we're exerting on the world at the present time and the fact that it's completely unprecedented. In other words, the weight of human beings vastly exceeds the weight of all the wild animals in the world right now. What can we do about it? The concluding section of what I want to talk to you about tonight. Well, to deal with this on the bigger level, we need to reach a level global population at a level where people can live as they wish. And that really depends on how we want to live, you know, how many people you can have. But for various reasons, it feels like we're pushing the highest limits now. We have to find acceptable levels of consumption per individual, and in the name of social justice, work to maintain them, and that's worldwide. We can't have things like that picture of food I showed you. In the long run, it just doesn't work. It's the kind of thing that makes people kill one another, and we are all on one planet, even though we tend to forget that. We have to develop a lot of new technologies and deploy them for the sake of global sustainability. And very especially, we have to promote equal opportunity for every person, and especially for women and children around the world. Women are, 1 billion women or so live in societies where they have no opportunity to do anything but cook, stay at home, gather firewood, and bring water, and the children are treated much the same way. And that's a double whammy. I mean, you keep growing if you don't give women any say in what's going on, you grow population rapidly, inevitably, because, you know, there they are. You just do it. Women who've had the most education in Mexico have the fewest children. It's a direct relationship. The other point is, you know, the motto of the United Negro College Fund is "a mind is a terrible thing to waste." And if you have 1 billion people in the world who are so discriminated against that they can't offer anything of what they have in their own brains and in their own abilities, we're just throwing away huge opportunities for the whole world. Look at this starving kids in Africa. If you thought that little kid on the right there had the musical talent of Beethoven or the literary talent of Shakespeare, where would it get? You know, what could it be? And there's absolutely no reason, there's no a priori reason why they shouldn't. The little kid on the right might be the smartest person in the whole world, so you have to face the fact that you're not only being immoral, you're being stupid unless you pay attention to that relationship. 50% of the world's population lives on less than $2 a day, is malnourished in terms of at least one major nutrient. 1 in 8 people is literally starving at any one point. That's not a world. And here's an example. Again, this is just a tiny vignette of current news of what's going on, you know. Miss Devi was mortified over having no sons because girls' parents must provide a dowry, whereas boys are seen as future earners. That's the kind of thing you get into. That accounts for an incredible number of premature killings of girl babies in India and China and other places, either by abortions or after being born. It's considered so awful. And of course, that's just not right. It's not right. It's not smart. It's just plain stupid. We have to do something about pollution. We have to use new technologies to try to conquer the problems that we face. We have to do everything we can to level the population, to find social equality, and to employ new technologies. But only a moral change will really bring that about. No politician can run on any of that, and that's why we work so hard to think about what people want. As I pointed out at noon today, World Ecology Day in 1970 had 20 million people in the United States actually came out for one event, and one place or the other, which was 1 out of every 10 people in the country. And given that kind of level of commitment, it's perfectly logical that all of our major environmental legislation was signed by President Nixon in the several years following. If we feel that deeply about it, we could get the same result now. If we don't, nothing will ever happen. People will just fight in Washington and elsewhere over petty differences in policy and things that make absolutely no difference at all. Now, if you take it down to the individual level, and here's more of the direct work of the Arboretum, what can we do about it? We can get information as widely and efficiently as possible, taking some priorities in groups that are economically or ecologically important. We can disseminate it widely, and we have great tools for doing that now, comprehensive databases, and expand parks and reserved areas. Here's a field trip of the editorial committee of the Flora of China, which I co-chaired for about 20 years after doing about 10 years of politics to help it get started. And we're there on top of Huangshan, the beautiful yellow mountain in coastal China, which I hope you all have the pleasure of seeing one day. The Flora of China, 49 volumes, and it's entirely online, has illustrations of about 7,000 species. Lest you think that China is doing nothing about this, this is the growth in area of nature reserves in China from 1957 to 77 to 82, and then you see how it goes upward. And they are trying, they're replanting, they're restoring habitats and so forth, and rebuilding plant communities throughout the country. You can bring plants into cultivation in botanical gardens, and you have a wonderful new prospect here of enhancing this fabulous historical collection of North Temperate plants in the Arboretum by further exploration and by selective additions to make it an even more valuable tool for understanding and studying plants. If you have enough money, you can reproduce anything if you want to badly enough, but whereas vertebrate animals are very expensive to maintain that way per year or anything, because of seed banks, samples of plants, even trees and things, can be kept for very long periods of time in cold storage and thus preserve the genetic diversity of the species in a way that's not available for animals. And as you can see there, the pandas in China are very friendly and anxious to greet you, so I hope you'll have the opportunity to go there and understand it better. So the conclusions to wind up would be the future of China, the United States, and the world depends on our attainment of sustainability. It's not a matter of individual nations getting ahead or doing things or collecting things or beating up people that they think are dangerous to them. It's a matter of individual nations and people collaborating and cooperating and trying to figure out how to handle it better. Multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-belief kind of society like you have in Boston is a very good way to, a very good model for the whole world, because by force, when you have an accumulation of people like you do in a major city in the United States, you will at some level learn to get along with and try to understand other people in a way that you couldn't if you weren't actually living with them. National, international coordination has to go far beyond what we know now. I mean, most people are not very concerned with homeless and poor people in their own hometowns. I mean, they may pay lip service to it, but what do they do? So how do you encourage internationalism? Well, I think you travel, you send your kids abroad, you try to go to developing countries, you try to understand at a level that you can never do it, because really, to solve this problem, we've got to have, in whatever measure we can have, the love that we all feel for members of our own family to be extended, not only the poor and needy people around us, but to all the people in the entire world, which sounds like a tall order, but you do it one person at a time. You do it by caring. If we care, we can solve it. If we don't care, the world will just go down to where things break even worse than they are now. Our opportunities will be far less. We got to have new kinds of economics for national accounts and things that will include damage to the environment. Otherwise, it's like drawing money out of a bank account and saying, I'm making all this money every year. You know, eventually it's gone. There are a few very smart economists working on steady state economics, but all I ever have to think to get concerned about that problem is if Christmas sales are less than a 4% increase a year, then you say this is a disaster. But Put 4% increase a year into your computer and see how many years it takes to get to infinity. And then wonder how the whole thing can be based on 4% a year. You know, it really can't be. We've got to increase public awareness, particularly with children. We've got to maintain the sustainability of countries from which we draw raw materials. If China or the United States or other people go around the world buying land and importing things and all, we've got to maintain sustainability there. Too much of the colonial attitude where you treat other countries as mines for timber, for beef, or whatever you want, which destroys those countries and is ultimately unsustainable in an end way for you too. Numerous opportunities exist for cooperation, but our efforts are pitifully small. Just to illustrate some of the points, here's global warming culprits judged by size. You can see that the United States by size is the biggest, but Germany and the UK are surprisingly high. India's pretty high, and so forth. And here's the same thing judged by population. We're about on a par with Russia, whereas China is not even in the baddie category, even though they emit more carbon dioxide than we do now, and so it goes. As the head of the Global Footprint Network, and the website is just the last two words there joined into one word, said, in some areas of the world, the implications of ecological deficits can be devastating, well, are being devastating, leading to resource use, economic collapse, debt, poverty, famine, and war. And that's a world in which we find ourselves. It's difficult to attribute a lot of things that are going on to the individual trends, and yet the attribution is realistic. Here are three quotes that I think sum it up rather well. Dan Jansen, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, said this in the 60s, "The earth is a garden and we're all its gardeners. If we take the responsibility for it, we will take care of it. If we don't care and just making out on our own, we won't." The second chapter of Genesis, verse 10, it says, God put man in the Garden of Eden to save and care for it. Are we saving and caring for it? Are we really looking out for our future? Well, pretty poorly. Stuart Brand, the editor of the coevolution of the world, Whole Earth Catalog, which started as the Coevolution Quarterly, came out with this pithy quote, "If we're going to act like gods," and we are, whether we face it or not, we should try to get good at it. I think that sums it up very well too. And Dan Jansen, again, 2 years ago at the 50th anniversary of the Organization for Tropical Studies, which is a group in Costa Rica that Harvard was very instrumental in founding, Jansen said this, it sounds very simple-minded, but if you think about it, it's not simple-minded at all. You might think doing things, saving some vegetation, living in harmony with it is futile, but it's anything but futile. It's totally necessary, because if we don't, it's simply gone. You can't redo it. That's why Ed Wilson of OEB here calls the loss of species the sin for which our descendants are least likely to forgive us. As species are dying off, becoming extinct, they're just not there anymore. So the world is a fantastic place. That's Hualong Bay in Vietnam. We can think about trying to save individual places that we love, but still you come down to the reality, and the world is only one world, and it's no good to say China's founding a development bank and we have to keep away from it because we need a bigger bank, or they're a bunch of savages over there, or they're going to eat us up, or they're not. I mean, they may be, and you know, you can't be stupid and just commit suicide. But on the other hand, if we don't get out of this pattern, try to understand, travel, get to know people, understand people, love people, and care about people, there's really no hope at all for preserving the sort of thing that we call civilization much beyond 30 or 50 years, because the pressures will simply be too great for anybody to care about what we think is valuable right now. Supporting a great institution like the Arboretum is one very good way to care about it, or an institution like Harvard in various ways. because they do teach children, they do teach people, they do develop knowledge, they do take action, but never make the mistake of thinking that your individual actions are without merit. They're exceedingly important. They add up to a great contribution to the world, to the improvement of the world situation. And you never should lose sight of what you can do, and by doing it and by talking, impart to others. Thank you very much for your attention. I've run over time a little bit.
Your last words, Peter, are tremendously inspiring. Every one of us holds the key to the future. So thank you again, Peter, and we'll adjourn to the next one.
They grow 1 centimeter every 100 years. I mean, so it gives me a chill even saying it, because I just think about what if that was what you accomplished in your entire lifespan. Continents are drifting away faster than these lichens are growing.